Hello and welcome to Counting the Earth, a brand new podcast from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, where we explore the numbers behind nature. I'm Alice Hope.
And I'm Sue Nelson.
Throughout this podcast, we will be picking apart the jargon and misinformation surrounding climate and biodiversity and tallying up the contributions that the natural world makes to our lives, always through the lens of one number.
In today's episode, we're looking at that truly iconic feature of the British countryside, the hedgerow. What are the hidden benefits to these staples of rural and urban landscapes? And do we have enough of them?
And our key number this time is a big one. 390,000, which is the number of kilometres of farm hedgerow in England. That's almost enough to wrap around the earth 10 times.
That's quite an extraordinary figure. Coming up, we'll be speaking to Devon farmer Robert Walton, who spent 2 years counting the different species he found in one hedge on his farm and discovered a staggering number of visitors and residents.
And we hear from UKCEH ecologists Joe Staley and John Redhead to explore that big number further and see the ancient art of hedge laying in action.
So if we're looking at hedgerows today, we need to start with the basics. And I don't think you can get any more basic question than this, Alice. But how are we defining a hedgerow?
Yeah, it's a really important question, actually. But when we think about a hedgerow, most people will just picture a sort of bushy wall of green or brown. But what's also important is the bank that it grows out of, the ground beneath it. There's often a ditch and the grassy borders at the sides. And that's what ecologists would mean by a hedgerow. It's the whole package rather than just the plants themselves.
Wow, so that's a lot more than I would have thought of when thinking about hedgerows for starters. It is a very British thought, and I know American visitors always rave about a hedgerow. They don't see them at home. And they're these amazing markers of social, political, agricultural change that the country's been through. Do we know how long Brits have been using hedgerows to divide up land? My guess would be around 300 or 400 years.
The British use of hedgerows goes way further back than that, and there are actually hedges in Cornwall that are thought to date back to the Bronze Age. But we started using hedgerows more commonly around the Tudor time, so about 600 years ago, to mark the perimeters of fields where landowners were enclosing common land for their own use. And this peaks at around the sort of mid-18th to 19th centuries.
That explains why I thought it was a little bit more recent than that, because I have read that book, Harvest, by Jim Crace, which is actually all about the Enclosure Act, which makes it sound like, what, really? But it's an incredible book. And if you're interested in hedgerows and how they did become this sort of political power grab and act, I don't know if you've read it, Alice, but if you haven't, put it on your list.
I haven't, so that is definitely going on the to-be-read list. 1950 is where we were probably at peak hedge.
Peak hedge.
A Forestry Commission report put the combined length of rural hedges in the UK at around 1 million kilometres.
Now, apart from loving that phrase, peak hedge, I was amazed at the start of the podcast about there being 390,000 kilometres in England. But if there was once over 2.5 times, I reckon, that number with 1 million. So what on earth happened for there to be such a huge reduction?
Yeah, it is quite a staggering reduction. And in a word, war. So after the Second World War, there was a huge focus on food security. And the government actually started rewarding farmers for digging out their hedges to expand the size of fields and intensify agriculture. So it's estimated that around 30 to 50% of hedges were lost in that 50 years to the end of the 20th century. And government regulations did slow down that loss eventually, but a fair bit of what we do have left isn't always managed in the best way. There's quite a lot of mechanised overcutting, or it just gets neglected, which allows the hedge to grow into a line of trees instead of staying as a sort of shrubby hedge.
Yeah, now, of course, not all of the UK or even all of England favours hedges. And as I know from my own travels and my childhood, actually, you don't see a lot of hedges in mid North Wales, the uplands of Scotland. You do see a lot of dry stone walls as sort of field barriers in parts of Derbyshire and Yorkshire, because I've done quite a lot of walking in the Dales, and they're really attractive, these stone walls. But let's face it, nothing beats a hedgerow. And the hedgerow heartland of the UK, we can call it, is Devon. And that's where our first guest is from. Farmer Rob Walton, he's intimately, and we can say that, we're intimately acquainted with the Devon hedge, as he spent 2 years recording the species that lived in a hedge on his Oakhampton farm. So both of us managed to persuade him, didn't we, to take a break from his farm to discuss his findings. As this podcast is called Counting the Earth, Robert, let's start with the number of species that you found in this one hedge. How many did you count?
Well, it was 2070.
That's incredible. I can't even begin to think how you actually counted that many species. How did you go about doing that?
The hedge is just about 100 yards from my front door. So I spent an awful lot of time over 2 years just going out there and looking for things. And of course, the trees and the shrubs and the mosses, they're all fairly easily done. But then I had traps out as well, in particular insect traps. And there's one trap, a Malays trap, that was very productive.
And what exactly is a Malays trap? What does that look like?
It's a sort of tent-like structure. It's named after a Swedish scientist called René Malays. And he invented this trap, which is quite extraordinary in its ability to catch flying insects. But it's basically a netting screen. And because insects, when they hit a screen, they tend to move upwards towards the sun. And then they get to a ridge, they move along the ridge, and then they end up in a bottle at the end of the ridge, which I then sampled every day or so.
What type of hedge was it?
It was a Devon hedge, so it was a good hedge. Lots of different types of shrubs and trees in it, thick and bushy, with a little bank slumped over the edge, and some nice flower-rich margins.
Now, you say Devon hedge. As somebody who doesn't live in the county, what exactly do you mean by a Devon hedge? What sort of plants made this up?
Well, when I talk about Devon hedge, it's basically a hedge that's got an earth bank underneath it, and it's also species rich. So the main shrubs are, there's some hawthorn in there, but it's a lot of hazel and birch. And well, I suppose in all there are 12 different species of shrub present there.
And that must make a difference, I assume, because I've got a beech hedge in the back of my garden. Although we found the odd hedgehog, I can't imagine finding 2,000 species there.
Well, of course, the more different types of plant you have, trees and shrubs, the more species you like to get. But do remember, most of the species I found are very small. And the trouble is, we're very big. And it's difficult for us to actually see most of what's there. Most of those 2070 different things I found were insects. And a lot of those, I just wouldn't have seen myself if it hadn't been for traps like the Malays trap. We are just too big and we're too fast. But there's all those creatures there that we miss the whole time. In Devon, we have a term called pausch. It means to walk slowly while looking. And that's what we need to do more of to appreciate the full diversity of life living in hedges.
Thinking then about those species that people might be a little bit more familiar with, I think a lot of people, like you say, we're quite big animals and we focus on the bigger animals as well. Did you find any sort of rare or threatened species?
Well, quite a lot. There are about 60 in all of things that are nationally scarce or rare. But just to pick out an example, there were hazel dormice in the hedge, which of course are wonderful charismatic creatures. I expected to find them because we have a good population in our hedges on the farm. I mean, people think about them as being a woodland species, but they're not. They're a species of scrub and maybe woodland edge. And of course, hedges are really, they're bits of woodland edge, aren't they? Or long lines of scrub, and they're ideal habitats for dormice. And I was really pleased to see some in there. They build these natural nests in the bramble. And if you look carefully, you can find them. And if you gently disturb them and you have the necessary license, then you can see them and they pop out a little bit and stay there to be photographed before going back into their nests. Wonderful creatures.
Yeah, they're so charismatic, aren't they, hazel dormice? I have to say, I've never had the privilege of seeing one, but possibly is because they are quite sort of solitary and secretive. And like you say, unless you disturbed the hedge, you're unlikely to see them. Thinking about things that might be a bit easier to see then, what about birds that you found in the hedge? Did you find any sort of that surprised you or any particularly rare or threatened birds?
Well, there were a few. I mean, I suppose the rarest is the willow tit, which, although they weren't breeding in the hedge, not nesting there, we have a reasonable population in the surrounding landscape. And they were going through the hedge, often with flocks of other birds, picking up insects and berries and so forth as they go. They're considered endangered, I think, now at a national level. But because they're man-made habitats, I mean, you wouldn't expect them to contain loads and loads of really rare species. They do, of course, have threatened species, particularly those in a farmland context. Things like yellowhammers, which are declining, are largely reliant on hedges. But majority of the things you find, of course, are the common and widespread things for which hedges are desperately important.
What was your favourite thing that you found?
That's always a very difficult question, isn't it, to answer? I mean, I've already mentioned the hazel dormice. I have a really deep love of those. But other things I find, which just some of the extraordinary little things you find you don't expect to find. So, for example, when I was looking in the little shallow ditch that runs along the hedge and is part of it, I found these tiny, tiny little white mussels, pea mussels, just a millimetre or two long. And I had no idea that you got freshwater bivalves occurring in hedges. So that was a real surprise to me.
No, I would never have thought that you'd find shellfish in a hedge.
No, quite.
Your findings show how important hedgerows are to wildlife with the number of species that you found. Were these species temporary residents or permanent residents in your hedgerows?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, people often think about hedges as just corridors, as highways along which animals are moving to get from one place to another. But they're actually really good habitat in their own right. And I reckon most of those 2,070 species were actually living in the hedge, not mainly permanently. Some of them been moving through, but it's really good habitat in its own right. It's providing food, it's providing nesting places, and it's also providing shelter from the elements, the wind and so forth, and security from predators.
What was it that made you want to study the hedge in the first place? I assume you didn't just sort of wake up one day and decide to study the hedge outside.
No, you can blame that to a certain extent on John Stokes from the Tree Council, because he and I, we were on a car journey through Suffolk somewhere, and that was in 2010. And we were just talking about how many different species there are in a hedge, and we realised we didn't know. And so he laid down that challenge to me. He said, "Find out, Rob." And so on New Year's Day, 2011, I started counting.
Now, you spent 2 years studying the hedge as a hobby. Now, this was 2011, so that's quite a while ago. Are you going to update this study now that over 10 years has gone by to see whether the number of species has gone up or down?
Uh, I hadn't got any plans, Sue. It was a lot of work. And I'm not sure all those experts who helped me identify them all will be willing to do it all over again. But I would lay the challenge out to other people to do the same thing. And I'd love people to look at hedges in other parts of the country, and particularly some of the sparser hawthorn hedges you get across the Midlands, to see how many species they contain. And my guess is that even though they're not of the same quality of the hedge I looked at, you would still be staggered at the number of things that they contain.
Well, there's a challenge to everybody from Devon farmer Robert Walton there. Now, we already have butterfly counts and bird counts because I usually take part in them every year. I've even done a cowslip count, actually, I think. So I think a hedgerow species count sounds a great idea. And if anyone listening would like to take up that challenge, please do.
Yeah, 2,070 species is the target to beat, isn't it? I wonder if anyone would manage it.
I'm not sure.
There's so much life and it's such an important habitat and an important corridor as well for linking different habitats together.
Well, it does make me think, if he found these freshwater bivalves, which I, like you, completely astonished by, it does make you wonder what else you might be able to find in a hedge.
But that is just one hedge on one farm. So let's return to our opening number of 390,000 kilometres of hedgerow in England alone. Imagine if all of that was as well maintained and as full of life as Robert's hedgerow, and what a difference that could make to British wildlife and habitats. I wanted to find out more about the hedges that make up that big number of 390,000. So I went to meet with one of the ecologists that helped compile that data, which is John Redhead from the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, along with his colleague ecologist Joe Staley, to learn more about the state of Britain's hedgerows. There is a strip of hedgerow either side of me on a green lane in Oxfordshire. Down the far end, the more mature hedgerow is about 4 metres tall, but this hedge is quite special because it's in the process of being laid. So it's been cut and woven in between wooden stakes. And this is a mixed species hedge, so we've got a mixture of hawthorn, blackthorn, dogwood and field maple, and that makes it quite an unusual hedge. So Joe, tell us a little bit more about this hedge. Is this a healthy hedgerow?
So absolutely, Alice. So looking down the hill at the hedge before it's been managed, it's fairly tall and wide, which is great. We know there's lots of wildlife species that benefit from taller, wider hedges. The other thing that's great is seeing this hedge laying going on. That means that in the long term, the hedge will remain thick and it won't develop gaps. And we know that that's also really good in terms of supporting wildlife.
John, you were involved in the mapping project that gave us this episode's big number of 390,000 kilometres of farm hedgerow in England. So how did you go about collecting that data?
So what we did was to produce a map of all the hedges in England using what we call LiDAR data. And that's a laser rangefinder mounted on an aircraft, and it fires a laser pulse at the ground and it measures the time it takes for that laser to return to the aircraft, and that tells you how high above the ground the thing that the laser's bounced off is. Now, we collected data from the Environment Agency, which originally did this big LiDAR survey, and we processed that to detect hedgerows across the whole of the countryside.
390,000 kilometres in England, that seems like quite a long way off from the UK-wide estimate in the 1950s, which gave us 1 million kilometres of hedgerow. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's important to remember that we were comparing a figure for England, which is what our map is for, with a whole UK figure. But actually we'd expect most of the hedgerows in the UK to be within England, because that's where we have our lowland farmland landscapes, which are traditionally divided up using hedgerows. So there's still going to be a big difference between those two figures, and that's because after the Second World War, as agriculture expanded, became more focused on intensive production, we got more big machinery, we got more artificial fertilisers, other ways of managing crops. We lost a lot of our hedgerows. They were taken out so fields could become bigger and more productive. So that's probably why those figures are quite so different. As well as that, a lot of the hedgerows in the country today are quite different from what they would have been back then. So hedgerows back then would have been quite well managed. They'd look like the hedgerows we can see either side of us now, using traditional things like hedge laying. A lot of our hedgerows now are cut very intensively, so they're actually cut down less than a metre tall, or they've actually been allowed to overgrow and are now lines of trees somewhere 6 metres plus in height.
We heard from Devon farmer Robert Walton about just how many species you can find in a hedgerow. So this loss of hedgerows over the decades, has that had a big impact on biodiversity?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know there's lots of our native wildlife that relies on hedgerows either for all of their life cycles or part of them. So for example, in the winter now, there'll be birds and mammals feeding on the berries in the hedges and using them for shelter. Then in the spring, when the flowers are out, pollinating insects come and collect the nectar and the pollen. And we know throughout the summer there are lots and lots of caterpillars of different moths and butterfly species that develop on the hedgerow leaves. So it is critical for lots of different wildlife species. Estimates have suggested that if we could increase our hedgerow density again, that would benefit the majority of the species that have been looked at.
Are there other benefits to having lots of well-maintained hedgerows?
There's a lot of interest in planting hedgerows to store carbon at the moment, both above ground in the woody biomass that you can see and also in the soil below ground. But there are also other benefits. So hedges can help to prevent flooding, they can provide shelter for livestock, which can reduce stress. And they can also reduce pollution, both air pollution if they run along roads, as a lot of our hedges do, and also noise pollution.
So we've talked about hedgerow loss already. Are we facing a continuing decline, or are there efforts underway to regenerate and repair our hedgerows?
So Natural England has a sort of broad ambition of increasing hedges by around 60% to support wildlife. There are some government ambitions and targets to plant or restore hedgerow length or restoration as well.
And the advantage of our new map is it gives a really accurate stock take of the amount of hedgerow that's already within the landscape. So we can look in detail at an individual landscape or a farm, say, well, how much hedgerow have they got in comparison to the local or regional average, and where are the best opportunities for recreating new hedgerows to better connect up the landscape, put those in the places that are going to deliver the absolute maximum benefit for biodiversity and the environment.
We've talked a lot about rural hedgerows and hedgerows on farms, but it's not just about rural hedgerows, is it? There are plenty of hedges in our towns, in our parks, and even in people's back gardens. So how important are they, and what should people do to maintain and improve their own hedges?
Yeah, absolutely. So urban hedges can contribute to wildlife in towns and cities. Again, some of the same principles apply, that if you can have a mix of woody species, that's great. If you can let your hedges grow up a bit taller and a bit wider, that's often better for lots of wildlife species. But even some of the really common species like privet, for example, supports the privet hawk moth. So certainly our urban hedges can provide benefit as well.
So it's not just about the quantity, the miles of hedgerow, but it's also about quality, isn't it?
So unfortunately, the last survey that we have back in 2007 showed that half of our hedges are in poor condition, and that means they're less likely to persist and they won't support wildlife as well. And often those are hedges that have been cut too short, they're very narrow, or they've just been allowed to get very gaffy and start dying back over time. So there's lots of options to rejuvenate these hedges. You can coppice them by cutting back at the base and you get regrowth from the cut stems. You can gap up and go along and plant new hedgerow plants in the gaps. Or one of the traditional methods is hedge laying, which we can see here today, Alice, on this farm.
I'm Alex Musson, I'm a hedge layer. Hedge laying is the ancient art of reviving old hedgerows, which otherwise would become lines of trees, into living boundaries, habitats for all manner of animals, from invertebrates through mammals and birds. You're trying to create new growth low down in the ground, so you cut most of the way through each stem of the hedge, each tree if you like, and you leave anything from 10 to 30% of the stem, what's called pleature, attached to the base, and then the heel, which is the remaining part, you cut off. And the idea is that both the pleature, which you've laid down, and the heel, which is the sort of stub of the tree, they both continue to grow and send up new shoots, creating a very thick and vibrant hedge with lots of mass low down to the ground, which is both good for habitat and good as a livestock barrier. Here we've got a hawthorn in poor condition. It's 2 inches across, and that's quite easy. So I'm just going to cut this little one with a chainsaw. So I've cut that down to about 30% remaining, and in a vertical angle from above. And I'm going to go through that with a billock, or the machete. You can hear that chopping down to the ground. And then, all being well, that will fold over neatly. And you can see there that it's folded, and the split's gone right into the ground there. And it's a very clean, what's called tongue. And then I'm going to cut off what's called the heel. I'm going to angle it backwards so that it runs off it backwards rather than going into the hinge. And so as soon as May, you'll see both new growth coming out of this pleature up right here, and also new growth coming out of what's called the heel here. We've laid the pleature down, and my colleague here, Rebecca, is meanwhile putting stakes in through the hedge, and the idea is each pleature passes through the line of stakes, and then later on we'll get some hazel binders, whippy binders, and we'll twist them along the top of the stakes to get that lovely effect that you see on laid hedges. The idea is the stakes and the binders together keep all the pleachers down so they don't pop up either in the wind or when the sap rises in the spring.
A big thank you to Joe and John there for showing me the science of the hedgerow, and also a little bonus from Alex Musson of the art of hedge laying. I had no idea that there was this ancient craft that went with maintaining our hedges. And when I was there, I was really struck by the diversity of the plants within that particular hedgerow. And I know that was also true for Robert's amazingly diverse hedge as well. So I think I've just learned so much about the importance of diversity within a hedgerow.
Me too. And as someone is lucky enough to have a beech hedge in our back garden, it's the first time I've ever lived anywhere with a hedge which separates my garden from next door's. The first thing we noticed within days was, oh my goodness, how many birds visit this hedge? Oh my goodness, is that a little mouse under there? Is that a hedgehog under there? And that's just from one species. And I hadn't realised, as you said, this in terms of the diversity. And I just think, my goodness, that beech hedge, little garden hedge, is incredible for wildlife. Imagine what it would be like with all those species. So I'm sort of less surprised now that, they found that over 2,000 species, but at the same time, that's still an incredible number, as is the big number we started with for the number of hedgerows in England, which is
390,000 kilometres of farm hedgerow in England, which is just an astoundingly huge number. And yet it's not peak hedge, as it were.
No,
And
yes.
there are efforts underway to increase the amount of hedgerow, but also to regenerate the hedgerow that we have and to make it of better quality, not only for biodiversity, but also for lots of other things like increased flood defences, better air quality, to reduce noise pollution, and all these other things that the Great British Hedgerow contributes to.
And I love the reducing stress in the livestock quote. And I thought, well, I shouldn't be too surprised at that, because when you're out in nature, let's face it, it reduces stress for everyone. It would be lovely, wouldn't it, to do a similar podcast in 5 years' time on hedgerows, and wouldn't it be great if that number had gone up 500,000 kilometres? That would be incredible, because as you say, we've really heard the benefits of hedgerows in today's podcast.
And that rounds out this episode of Counting the Earth on Hedgerows.
Thanks for listening.